So welcome everyone. This is our last ideas seminar of this term, but we're delighted to have you all here with us. We'll be resume again in January. More details to come by email. Today, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Deen Freelon. I know Deen through his work with the Knight Centers and his excellent work in the communication area. Near and dear to all of our hearts is the fact that he is a computational social scientist and has actually been a pioneer in bringing computational techniques to the area of communication science. His work looks at how ordinary citizens use social media and other digital communication technologies for political purposes. He also then usually controls for and pays attention to issues related to identity, such as race, gender, and ideology, and how that affects and influences these uses. His work has been supported by people from places like the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Spencer Foundation, the Knight Foundations, Hewlett Foundations, etc., and has been published in a wide variety of venues, including Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academies. With that being said, I want to turn it over to our speaker today, Deen Freelon, who will be talking to us about analyzing social media from a user eye view with PIEGraph. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I appreciate it. And thank you to all of the participants and audience members. Let me share my screen so that you can see what I would like for you to see. So here's my slides. I'm going to hop out of this at some point so that you can see everything else that I want to show you. I also just want to say, if anybody came to the Knight Research Network tool demonstration about a month and a half ago, that I think also was hosted by Ideas, this is on the same, it's a different presentation, but it's on the same tool. So maybe a little bit new, maybe something that you've already seen if you check that out. So just a note as far as that goes. Now, I'm going to talk about this piece of technology that we developed over here at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. It's one that I think has some very important and interesting theoretical implications, and also one that does some things that, at least as far as I know, existing tools don't exactly do. Now, one thing actually that would be really helpful for me is that if you happen to know of any other tools that do similar things or have similar functionality to what I describe, I'd love to hear about them. Obviously, everybody who develops a particular tool lives in fear of developing the exact same thing that somebody else already did, or at least I do. So any other information on that would be really helpful if you happen to know of anything. So perhaps many of you are familiar with the social circumstance described by the political cartoon currently on the slide, wherein people are said to be trapped in hermetically sealed social media echo chambers. This is a somewhat felicitous metaphor for the social media environments in which we find ourselves, which, as the story goes, traps us in environments of our own design and possibly also of algorithmic design that are specifically formulated to screen out all countervailing opinions and to include only opinions and analysis and news content that agrees with our pre-existing opinions. This phenomena has been known by a number of names, including echo chambers, filter bubbles, cyber balkanization is kind of an older one. Media fragmentation is also another term that you'll hear. And this is what I refer to as a crossover academic concept, because it's the sort of thing that you'll hear, on the Sunday political shows or on NPR, read about in the New York Times, certainly has had a fair amount of purchase outside of the academy. And so unlike most of the theories that I deal with, this is one that the average person on the street is more likely to have heard of and to have had some experience with. So, unfortunately, this idea of the echo chamber is somewhat, depending on who you ask, is somewhat overblown or mostly false, because for a number of reasons. First of all, because it turns out that there is something of an asymmetry between the extent to which people are attracted to opinion consistent content and regarding the extent to which they are repulsed by opinion inconsistent information. Namely, they are attracted more to consistent information than they are repulsed by inconsistent information. So that's a asymmetry there. And also just generally by the fact that most people do not exist within hermetically sealed media environments. It's a very small number of people who do, but the vast majority of individuals do not. And so I like, instead of talking about echo chambers, I like to talk about personalized information environments that are co-constructed by users and platforms. Now, what I really like about this term is that it implies nothing about the contents of the environments, which may vary widely depending on many factors. So theoretically, other terms with which you may be familiar include mass self-communication as promulgated by Castells, disintermediated media systems as promulgated by Dews, and public spherules as introduced by Gitlin. So these are all terms that I think avoid the sort of, a priori assumptions that echo chamber builds in to any study that is tied to that particular term. So into this, general area of study of personalized information environments, I introduce or reintroduce this idea of the user eye view. Now, this concept is not entirely new, but then again, what is? So I borrow heavily from my colleague Erica mentioned Trevino's idea of vertical data, although the user eye view somewhat overlaps with it, but it's not entirely the same thing. Otherwise, I would have just called it vertical data. And so I feel like this is a concept that could really use a fresh coat of conceptual paint, as it were, when we're talking about these metaphors. And so I think many of you, I suspect if you're coming to this presentation, many of you will be familiar with the traditional paradigm in social media research, wherein a researcher chooses a keyword or keywords or other criteria by which they pull data out of a given social media system, or sometimes more than one, and they study the messages and replies and other content that are associated with or contain those particular keywords, or perhaps from a certain subset of users. Now, that's the way that a lot of social media research is done. The user eye view perspective stands in contraposition to this dominant paradigm. And the purpose of it is to see as the user sees. There have been a number of studies that have attempted to do this. If you're familiar with web tracking studies, they do a version of this, and I'll talk more about web tracking in a little bit. But if you've done web tracking, you know that it is methodologically difficult and expensive. And that's why it's not done more often. It is far cheaper to simply use an API to pull data out that's based on a particular subject or a random sample or based on certain user set. And so the user eye view is tough to do. That's right. So this is right. This is the platform center view. And so this data that you're viewing actually comes from a very well-known study by Atomic and Glantz, which came out in 2004, that's about weblogs. And so this is sort of the sociological viewpoint that is a really good fit for the platform-centered view. In contrast, the user eye view is really one that is more akin to, I hesitate to say that it's psychological necessarily, but I think it has some similarities and affinities to psychology in that the unit of analysis is the individual. And rather than looking at sort of broad, connections or sort of groups, it's really more individual focused. And it provides a different perspective, right? So I'm not saying that the platform center view is bad or that it doesn't have anything to contribute, but the user eye view really does make some contributions that the platform center view really can't get at, and vice versa. The opposite is also true. So, and again, right, the general principle here is that each view has its own distinct advantages and disadvantages. So platform views are good for studying particular topics, right? So when you have that keyword or a set of keywords that you use to pull data out of social media systems, it's really great at doing that. I've done a lot of research in this way. So I've looked at, Black Lives Matter. I've looked at Russian disinformation agents, and those are all studies that have been done through the platform-centered view. It's also good for understanding online group dynamics. And so when you want to do, for example, mass social network type research, this is a really good way to do it. And when you want to look at how group dynamics change over time, this is another really good way to do that. If you want to look at influencers and who they influence, it's very easy to kind of define who those are in advance and do your platform-centered view that way. So for example, if you want to look at, Congress and other people who are really at the top of any particular government, you can look at that in terms of who they influence, who influences them. And that is fundamentally platform-centric research. The user eye view is good for a different set of research goals, including understanding the content of specific personalized information environments, answering questions like, what is the average amount of or average degree rather of quality of the political information that people are receiving, and more broadly, how much political information do people consume relative to other types of information? Determining how information diversity on an individual level changes over time. So this is something that I think has a built-in hypothesis, right? We know, for example, that people pay a lot more attention to politics during election years. And so if we can look at what they're seeing during election years, the hypothesis would be that there's going to be a lot more politics than in off-election years, in which you would expect there to be a lot more less political content that they're seeing. And then, of course, there's this issue I've already touched on, which is ascertaining the amount of low-fact content in people's streams. And this is something that the current setup of this tool that I'm going to show you in a little bit, PIEGraph, is actually optimally set up to do. And I will show you a little bit about how it does that. So, but before I get to that, I want to look at some of the other software. I really do stress that what we have done with PIEGraph is something that really builds on other people's work, and I want to acknowledge that work. And I want to talk about specifically how PIEGraph differs from existing systems that take a user eye view. And what's interesting about these systems is I'm not making any sorts of claims about the technological superiority of PIEGraph over these systems. They're all good for different things. They all have their own distinct advantages and disadvantages, but simply to contrapose what PIEGraph does relative to these existing systems with which some of you may be familiar. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called NetQuest. And there are other systems that do similar things to NetQuest, including ComScore and Nielsen and some other ones, Web Historian, and finally a project out of Stanford University called SCREENOME. So NetQuest is a company that is based somewhere, I probably should figure out where, that offers access to a panel of users who consent to mobile and web tracking. So this is an opt-in panel of users who have said, yes, please track me on my phone and laptop, and presumably pay me. I definitely wouldn't do it for free. And so NetQuest is able to take this data and then sell it to researchers who have the money to buy it. And the data that they sell consists of web URLs, domains and timestamps, and hashed IDs. So you can't tell who the users are, but you can tell one user from the next via the hashes that they provide. And researchers can see the URLs and domains of wherever panelists visited. So think about this from a social media perspective. So somebody is looking at Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, or insert your social media here. And so NetQuest will be able to see it if you click on an outgoing link from those sites, but they can't see what you see if you don't click on it. So, that's so for a whole lot of Twitter and Facebook content, all you'll see is, oh, well, they were on Facebook, or here's the URL they visited. And so the visibility piece of it is lost unless the user happens to click on something. And we know that, and this is almost goes without saying, but people click on a small proportion of what they see in social media. And so this is a limitation of NetQuest and similar services. Next is Web Historian, which was developed by my aforementioned colleague, Erica mentioned Trevino, who works at American University in Washington, D.C. And Web Historian is a browser extension that reads users' Chrome histories. It collects full URLs and timestamps similar to NetQuest. Unlike NetQuest, it is open source and may be used by anyone. And also, unlike NetQuest, Web Historian is available to end users who want insight into their browsing habits. And so, in addition to being a research tool, it's also a tool for non-technical users to be able to kind of visualize their own browsing habits via fancy visualizations like the one you see on the right hand of the slide. And so, the ease of use and the open source nature of what's going on with Web Historian distinguish it from NetQuest, with which it has many similarities. The third user eye view piece of software I'm going to talk about is the Human Screenome project, which is run out of the Screenomix lab at Stanford University. Now, with the Human Screenome project, users install software on their devices that take a screenshot of that device every 5 seconds. So you're on your laptop, it's just screenshotting what you're doing every 5 seconds. Same thing on your phone. They do have clients, I think, for Mac, PC, and Android, but not for iPhone, because iPhone is a tough nut to crack. If you've worked on iPhones, you know this is true. One great advantage of the Screenomix Human Screenome project is that it is not limited to social media or internet-connected apps. So you can see what's going on, even if they're using things that are offline. You can look at apps which are notoriously difficult to get data out of because of how they're locked down on the devices that run them. And then once they so downloads all the information, sends it to a repository somewhere in the cloud, and there are automated systems that conduct OCR, optical character recognition, automated image tagging, and human labeling. Obviously, the human labeling can only be applied to a small minority of the large volume of data that they collect. If you think about, how many hours do you use your phone in a given day, and you're collecting one screenshot every 5 seconds, you multiply that by thousands of users, that's tons and tons of data over however long. You can only human label just a small portion of that. But there's a lot of automated labeling that goes on there. So a very interesting project. Obviously, I'm curious about how much money that costs. Seems like a pretty high dollar type of project there. And so this brings us to PIEGraph, which is our system that we developed in-house at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC. We call it PIEGraph. People keep calling it pie chart, which I find annoying. Don't call it pie chart. It is PIEGraph, because pie charts are not good information visualization tools. It's a specific tool, as I mentioned, with specific advantages and disadvantages. It has 3 basic components. The first is a social media app that collects user eye data via the API. Right now, it only supports the Twitter API, but its architecture could be adapted to other types of APIs if the company policies permit. Second component is a database of over 3,000 web domains that are pre-tagged for political bias and factual content. And these data come from a widely used site called Media Bias Fact Check. The third component is a survey that is given of the participants of the system that collects basic demographic, political, and media opinion data from an opt-in panel of users, and we're currently securing permission to get that, but they're gonna fill that out, and then we'll have all that information about them. So right now, I'm actually gonna demo PIEGraph for you so you can take a look at what it looks like. You can also sign up for your own PIEGraph, not really an account, it's just linking the PIEGraph app to your Twitter account. If you have a Twitter account, you can do this. Just go to pcad.ils.unc.edu. Anybody can sign up for this. Obviously, you're not going to be included in the research, but you can take a look at it. So the first thing you see is this login to Twitter, right? You click on that, and then it says authorize PCAD PI personalized information environment to access your account. And when I click on this authorize app, it's going to redirect me back, and then it's going to start showing me this nice little visualization here. So I'm just going to go ahead and describe what you're looking at. This is a chart that the users of this system will be able to see. And so somewhat similar to Web Historian, this project has an educational component that doesn't require any coding to do. And so this particular chart has two axes. The X horizontal axis measures political leaning using the standard conventions of left and right. So everything to the left of 0 is liberal or left leaning, and everything to the right of 0 is right or conservative leaning. And then the vertical axis represents factual content as determined by media bias fact check. And we rescaled it. So there are 6 values that sites can have. 0 represents a value that is known as mixed, truth value or truth content. Sorry, people are joining all the time here. And so anything above 0 represents a fact content value of greater than mixed, and -1 and -2 represent mostly false or really false. And so as you can see, the vast majority of my content is in the left-leaning and above mixed factual content quadrant. And so the size of each bubble represents the prevalence of that particular domain within my feed. So my biggest one is Slate, which occurs almost 4,000 times between the time period covered by this chart, which started in late August. And so from late August to now, I have seen, what has appeared in my Twitter feed is nearly 4,000 Slate links, nearly 122 Gizmodo links, 1637 The Nation links, 1450 Washington Post links. Over on the right-hand side, I see the American Conservatives appeared, actually Wall Street Journal is 249. What is this one? Politicite is 38. New York Post is 31. Daily Mail is 24. So this gives you a really quick, ideally you want to have most of your content above that x-axis. So I do have a few that fall below there, including Move On, the Daily Mail, the Economic Times. But the vast majority of my content on the left and the right is above that x-axis, which is exactly where you want to be. Now, if you scroll down, you'll see some additional information. If I click on chart data, you'll see that I have in tabular format the most frequently occurring media sources in my feed, the ones that I'm most likely to see. So you can see that many of these, for me personally, are left-leaning. Slate, right? Wired, The Verge, The Nation, WRAL, Democracy Now! I also have a couple of local affiliates, ABC 11 and WRAL, which are a couple of network affiliates. I forget which networks they are. You can see their political leanings all to the left. Credibility, which actually should say fact content. I asked the programmer to change that. Number of occurrences, and then a political affiliation is simply just a binned version of the more granular political leaning value here. If I go to tweet statistics, I'm going to go to tweet statistics first because home timeline tweets takes a second to load up. So I'll click on that and hopefully this will pop up. You can see that I've got my mean credibilities, which is 1.78. It's almost 2, which is great. So that means my credibility or fact content is pretty high. The median is 2, so I'm slightly below the median. That's kind of annoying. Also, the reference categories for these particular figures will be the users that participate in our study that we're going to compensate. They have not been added yet, but that's what this will mean in terms of mean and median for the pi values over here. And then political bias, you can also see that my bias is somewhat to the left of everyone else in the system, which is over here. Median is only slightly to the left. Then you have the SD down here. If you see the bottom, you see only 4.88% of users have more left-wing content, but 48.78 users have a higher fact content than me. So, might want to work on that. And I'm just going to show home timeline tweets real quick. I think so, because I follow a fair number of people on Twitter, and so this typically takes a few seconds to load for me. So I'm going to just wait for a second to see if this pops up. Sometimes I get like your JavaScript's moving really slow. Do you want to keep it going? But usually it'll still pop up if I click that. So we'll see if that happens. It just takes a second to load up. Well, I'm actually gonna check on this a little bit later. So we'll see if that's, yep, there it is. So if I click wait, it'll usually pop back up. One thing that's actually really important about this from a user perspective is that the more content you have up here, the more the home timeline tweets actually take to load. So basically, the longer this goes, the more content that there it is, popped up there. So you can see the actual tweets in the context of the stuff that's been added here. So you can see the user that contributed the information, the original tweet text, and the source, and the political leaning and the credibility here. So there's a whole bunch of this. You can see there's almost 3,000 pages of this. So that's part of why it took so long to load. I'm going to try to see if we can adjust it to maybe just get the most recent content, because I think that's a little bit long to wait personally. I'm going to pop back in here. So that was sort of the basics of the user interface of the PIEGraph system. Now, obviously, there's a lot going on under the hood, and I'm happy to talk about that during Q&A if folks are interested. So one of the questions that I think that most academics would have about this system is, where are you getting your data for scoring these particular domains on the two-dimensional axis? And that comes from a site called MediaBiasFactCheck.com. It has comprehensive coverage of many widely used English language news and political sites, detailed explanations of ratings. The data have been used in multiple peer-reviewed studies, and most importantly, the data are free, which is really great. I just asked the proprietor if I could use it, and he was like, "Sure." I offered to pay him. He refused my money, so that was refreshing and really nice. And now we have that data that is integrated into our system. Here is a look at how Media Bias Fact Check scored the New York Times. You can see that it has a high rating, which corresponds to a numerical rating on our system of 2, and also that it has left center bias. And you can see the full page. This is just a part of the page. You can actually see the full page on mediabiasfactcheck.com/new-york-times, and you can take a look at many other sites on there and the justification that they give, both in terms of the bias rating that they give, politically speaking, and the factual reporting rating that they give as well. So I wanted to give you just a sense, since we don't have a whole lot of our user data or our participant data loaded in yet, I wanted to give you a sense of what the underlying data look like by analyzing my own personal data. So the analyses that you're looking at cover a time span of October 1st through November 14th, which is about a month and a half, covering almost 10,000 tweets. And that's only including tweets that only includes tweets that had a link that was included in our pre-tag database. This data set includes 326 unique domains and was posted by 828 unique users. And so let's take a little bit, I wouldn't really call this a deep dive, but I would say that we're going to dip our toe into one particular data stream here, which I am happy to do. So the first thing that you see is this is my top domains, and this actually recaps the same data that I showed you, showing that Slate was the number 1. You can see ABC 11, New York Times, The Nation, Democracy Now!, and so on and so forth. And this is just the same data that I just showed in a bar chart form. And so that's that. This is my top users, which is not provided as a default view within the PIEGraph visualization that the end user sees. And so you can take a look at this and see that Slate actually rises to the top of the users posting content. So that means all that means is that relative to other Twitter accounts that I follow. Slate is a high poster of links to itself. You can also see that there are a couple of deviations. So there's a lot of overlap between the top users and the top domains, but you can see a couple of top users that are not present in the top domains, including Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle, which are of interest to me because they are higher ed trade publications. And so they did not make the top domains list, but they did make the top users in terms of what they post. And so that's one instance in which you can see that there is some deviation there between the top users and the top domains. What you're looking at here is called fact bins. And so basically what I did was I looked at the total number of links that fell into various fact content bins. And if you recall, the 0 bin corresponded to a media bias fact check value of mixed. 1 corresponds to mostly factual. 2 corresponds to high fact content. And 3 corresponds to very high fact content. So you can see that about 75% of my links fall into the very high, second highest category. I have a smaller number, just shy of 20%, that falls into mostly factual, less than 5% mixed. I can't see any that are -1. And I think there's actually a few fewer very highs than there are mixed. But if you combine the mostly factual with the highs, you get into 90%. You can see that via this chart. So this is pretty good. Obviously, you can always do better, but just speaking as an individual, not as a researcher, I'm happy with this. And so this is a look at the fact political quadrants. And so if you can visualize for a moment with me the 4 quadrants of the chart that I showed you, right? So you've got left, above 0, left below 0, right above 0, and right below 0. So you can see that left above 0 represents well over 90% of my content. And everything else is much, much smaller. Left below 0 is less than 5%, as is right above 0 and right below 0. So I really have a lot of my eggs in one of those quadrants, as it were, and the vast majority of the rest of them are distributed among, or the small minority of the rest of them, rather, are distributed among the remaining 3 quadrants of that particular chart. And I like this chart because it actually expresses this quantitatively in a way that I think is hard to sort of put a specific number on. So looking at the bubble, just looking at the scatter plot, it was obvious that the vast majority of my content was on the upper left, but saying that it was 95% or 94% or whatever this is would have been harder to say just eyeballing it. So this chart looks at my mean factual content over time. And so I'll be the first to admit that this chart is pretty boring, but what it does point out is that for specific individuals, it raises the possibility that, for example, low fact content may increase at particular times. So when particular news, so I'm thinking about right now, right? So what's the biggest news in the country? Omicron variant. So maybe that's a big misinformation hub for people to start spouting content that's not true because this new variant emerges. And so we might expect that when there is new major news about a vaccine or about a treatment for COVID or about a new variant, that may spike relative to times when that kind of news is not current in the news. And so even though there's not a whole lot going here, I think the main take home of this particular chart is that those kinds of dynamics rather can be measured at an individual level and also at an aggregate level when you combine multiple participants. And so perhaps that compensates on some level for the not super interesting specific nature of this of my data here. And so this one is a look at my low fact friends. So these are people who had at least 10% of the links that they posted that were rated 0 or less, and individuals who posted at least 5 links. So to get on this list, they had to post at least 5 links And at least 10% of those links, which means if you've only posted one, that would be one. Well, no, it's actually, that's dumb. That's 20%. So that would mean that at least 10%, however many you posted, would have to be below zero. And so you can see that there are a couple of individuals here over at the left where 100% of the content that they posted were zero or below. And so that's AJ English. That's because Al Jazeera English is rated by Media Bias Fact Check as mixed. And Cocoa Butter BF, which is actually created by BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed News is actually, I think, rated mostly factual, but regular BuzzFeed.com is rated as mixed. And so that's why that's there. And so after that, it kind of declines, you can see. But what's interesting about this is that many of the individuals that are listed down here are academics and other journalists. And so they may be posting some of this content with a skeptical eye. And so what it goes to show is that just because an account is posting content that is rated by Media Bias Fact Check as being low fact content, that doesn't mean they believe it. That doesn't mean, that they are spreading it. They may very well be debunking it or making fun of it. Certainly, that's something that qualitative research and other forms of research would need to look into. But I think the point here is that you simply can't assume that just because somebody is posting something that Media Bias Fact Check rates as low fact quality, that they necessarily believe that or are spreading it in ways that indicate a goal of other people believing it. So I'm winding down here. Let me talk a little bit about PIEGraph versus similar approaches. And so one advantage is that it helps you to see what the user sees, right? So clicks are not required. You can see exactly what they see. And we know that people can be influenced by content that they don't click on. Many people simply read the headlines. People will see images and other content that don't require clicks. And so a paradigm like this is actually quite important to be able to capture all that content, remembering, of course, that clicks are only a minority or only represent a minority of content that people actually see. It captures more than just URLs. So it captures, so all the data that I showed were actually URL based, but we also capture content like hashtags and usernames and potentially images as well. We'd have to figure out how to do that. We have the images, but we don't really have a processing pipeline for them. But we could capture that if we wanted to. Covers both mobile and laptop content through API access. Basically, accessing the content through the API makes the mobile and non-mobile divide actually moot because all the data come through the same API. And so that's a really, really cool approach that you can take for systems that offer APIs that offer user eye views. The pre-tag database we use is highly extensible. So right now, the database that we have only looks at domains in terms of fact content and political bias, but you can also label it with lots of other types of dimensions. For example, you could look at race, you could look at gender, you could look at whether the domain represents a local news source. You can look at whether the domain represents crowdsourced elites as opposed to traditionally credentialed experts, all sorts of things. And so really just taking that basic logic of the pre-tag database and applying it to a data set like this is incredibly useful and can be extended in almost any direction people want to do. The system is lightweight, non-intrusive, and fault tolerant. So as opposed to a system that you have to install on somebody's phone or laptop, this is not a program that's going to crash on the user end. Obviously, there is potential of crash or other technical difficulties on the centralized end of things, but it's not really client-side software, so the risk of those client crashes are somewhat less. And finally, it will be open source when we're done with it. So it's still a work in progress. We still need to get some nav elements on there and change a few other things. But once it's done, it will be open source, similar to Web Historian, and folks will be able to take advantage of that and extend it as they see fit. But of course, it does have disadvantages. Chief among these are that it only supports Twitter for now. Facebook, I've heard, is a pretty tough nut to crack in terms of getting the API access necessary to have a user eye view. But we'll work on that, obviously. The architecture doesn't support non-internet apps, and so it is API based. And so unlike something like Screenomix, you would not be able to see content that is not connected to the internet or doesn't have an API. Doesn't capture what users click on, so we can't see exactly what it is that they're highlighting or liking or replying to. It simply captures content that is in their feeds and that they could have seen. But I think that's still valuable, but it does not capture those clicks. And then finally, one issue that I think is really a major bugbear for me is that PIEGraph is vulnerable to changes in corporate data policy. So this is what I've referred to in other writings as the post-API age. So in other words, if Twitter decided to shut down its user eye view API, then we'd really be screwed. Hopefully that Twitter over the past couple of years has really expressed a lot of interest in helping academics and providing services and better APIs for them. So my hope is that that'll last at least for the medium term. But of course, as a corporate entity, they could shut that down anytime they want. And that would really put a lot of our work to waste. This happened to me in 2018. I had developed a system to collect data from the Facebook Pages API, which of course was shut down in April of 2018 in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And I, of course, was left with a whole lot of unpaid hours of labor on this open source project that was now useless. So clearly I am a glutton for punishment because here I am doing it again. But I suppose I haven't learned my lesson there. I just really got to get that data. So let me talk about our current research project. So we are currently recruiting 1,000 US demographically matched users from a panel company. Each one will fill out a survey and grant PIEGraph permission to collect their data in the fashion that I showed you. Participants will be compensated after permission is granted. One really nice thing about this research setup is that no further participant action or background software is required. So in other words, we can passively collect their data after they give us access. They don't have to look at anything. They don't have to install anything. And participants can opt out anytime via instructions that will be on that website. The idea is to attract participants for a minimum of a year. We have the funding to do it for a year. We're going to try to get more funding to keep the project going. We're going to do it for at least a year. And so that will allow us and create a wealth of data that we'll be able to use to study people's political and non-political content consumption. So next steps. So I talked about this a little bit earlier. I talked about some of the things that the pre-tag database could be used. One example here is a broader topic classification scheme that would incorporate topics like entertainment, education, health, religion, that could allow researchers to analyze how individuals allocate their attention online. And so one of the major findings from this research is that political content only constitutes a very small proportion of everything that people consume. And so trying to fill out everything else and categorize everything else that people consume, I think, is a real priority. And you could do this pretty easily using a pre-tag database of domains. You can think about a race and gender tag database of users, especially the top users, most followed users, could enable a study of racial diversity in personalized information environments, as well as gender diversity. This is something that we plan on doing as well. You can get a lot of mileage out of tagging the top users. And so we are going to try to do that to see how far we can get with a project that is aimed at that particular goal. Another idea that we've had is creating a database of local TV, radio, and print outlets that can help us understand how much local news people are encountering. So you pair that with the geographic information that we're collecting from our opt-in users, and we can then figure out, okay, well, what percentage of the news that you're getting is from local outlets versus national outlets or region non-specific outlets. Another one is, if you combine the existing political fact database with a broad classification of top influencers, that could reveal alternative routes by which mostly not apolitical people receive political content. So one example of this that I think everybody will be familiar with is when celebrities comment on politics. So even if you're not following the New York Times and CNN, when, for example, this happened a couple of weeks ago, Gene Simmons reported or talked about how he wanted to isolate and segregate people who had not been vaccinated. That's one way that people sort of get into the politics of it without necessarily having to follow, traditional political sources of information, whether those be politicians or traditional news outlets. And so, given that most people don't really pay that much attention to politics, especially outside of election years, that could be a really interesting way of trying to figure out where people do get the incidental political content that they do receive. Seeing like a user. This is really important to remember. This is part of the theoretical mandate for this research. People are affected by much more than what they click on. So you can think about exposure to headlines, hashtags, and how other inline content can shape people's views. You can think about the illusory truth effect, right? The more that people are exposed to a particular claim, whether it's true or not, the more likely they are to believe that it's true. And so that really just goes to show, if you keep seeing something, regardless of whether you click on it, that's going to raise that illusory truth effect, amplified by confirmation bias. And that really exacerbates the issue over time. And finally, I just want to say that PIEGraph and other user eye approaches are complementary. PIEGraph is not necessarily intended to supplant any existing research program or application, but rather to provide another alternative for specific sets of research questions that folks may want to apply to their own research agendas. That is all. Thank you for your attention, and I am prepared to answer any questions that you may have.